Welcome to another episode of the Payment Strategy Show. I'm Brooke Smith, Content Manager at Rainforest. We're the embedded payments provider purpose-built for vertical software companies. And I am here today with Shanthi Shanmugam. Shanthi is the CEO of KSAP, the co-pilot and collaboration platform to automate disputes at scale. Shanthi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brooke.
Can you tell us a bit about your background? How did you get into fintech?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had the privilege of being the second product hire at Robinhood. Earlier, before we were a household name, we were in Fry's Electronics parking lot adjacent office with like 70 people at the company and with really, really big dreams. And I was there for the better part of 6 years. Spent time thinking about how to make crypto really seamless to invest in, right when crypto was mooning, as we like to say, in December 2017, all the way to thinking about how do we evolve Robinhood beyond a trading utility, beyond something where people come knowing exactly what they want to invest in and invest in it and leave, to a relationship with a financial institution that helps you think about what's really important to humans, which is wealth. And that's actually how I got into fintech. I thought a lot about, I was actually a PM at Facebook. That's actually where I met my now co-founder, Saisi. But a few months in, I just asked myself, I was like, I think, as humans, I think there's two things that matter to us most, which is health and wealth. And it would be really cool to think about how we could apply tech to make a real positive impact in either of these categories. So that's how I found Robinhood. Robinhood found me, and I was there for a really, really great ride and stumbled across the idea for KSAP. And now that's what I'm working on.
How did you stumble upon it? What's the backstory?
I'd always found creating a financial institution kind of from the ground up to be extremely rewarding at Robinhood. And we had an opportunity to think of things from first principles. It really just means like, don't just build it the same way as it's always been done because that's how it's been done. And in doing that, I just knew I'd at some point find something where it's like, oh, if we could help every single financial institution do this better, it's going to make a real difference for everyone. I just didn't think it would be disputes. I didn't think it would necessarily be fraud. But when the whole GameStop situation happened, I was tasked with thinking about how do we build trust quickly. And when we think about any relationship with the financial institution, in all honesty, if my payments are smooth and everything's happening as I expect it to be, doesn't make a difference if I'm banking with a large, big bank or a more regional credit union. It's all the same. But it's when things aren't going well, like people not being able to trade something they want to trade, like GameStop, or there's fraud, or there is a transaction they don't recognize and they need to file a dispute. Those are the moments of truth. And when I was tasked with thinking about how to build back trust, they and my team launched 24/7 phone and chat support. And in doing that, we realized if we don't actually take a first principles approach to how we operate payments and the platform that we provide to our back office team, we're going to have to essentially balloon our entire organization to really band-aid the fact that we have extremely archaic tools built on an extremely archaic infrastructure. So we took a really, Robinhood-esque approach and found ways to be extremely seamless and versatile with how we provide instant resolution for people that need it most while not losing the shirts on our back to fraud. And I realized that a lot of the things that we were trying to do are the same things that every financial institution is trying to do. And it really slapped me in the face when I was catching up with Saisi and realized that he, during his time at Chime, had to solve really similar problems in really similar ways. And at that point, I kind of asked myself, well, Robinhood, Chime, they're kind of these unique, larger fintechs. Maybe other people have it figured out in a different way. But when I talk to bank executives, credit union executives, fintech executives, everyone is trying to solve the same problem. They're trying to build a really deep financial relationship with as many people as possible and really earn that share of wallet. Right. And that mind share. And a really great way to lose all of that is by really messing up these moments of truth, like fraud and disputes. So that's when it just became really clear that this was a really important problem to solve. And given that Stacey and I had spent, the better part of a decade sort of living and breathing these problems, we were like, okay, yeah, makes sense. I think we can do this in a better way. So KSAP actually stands for Get Your Case Done ASAP. So the whole idea is, can we actually make it super easy and efficient to help the people that need it most while also identifying fraudsters? And it felt like disputes was a great place to start because disputes significantly damage trust. In fact, 20% of cardholders stop using their card after a negative dispute out. And then a lot of fraud loss is attributed to disputes, specifically first party fraud, which is not what a lot of people have spent their time thinking about when we say fraud. We think it's some hacker out in a different country taking over bins, but it's actually, the person next door kind of being opportunistic and maybe living in a gray area about what they did and did not buy, hoping their, bank or credit union or fintech could just give them their money back. And then also the regulatory landscape, right? So as the regulators themselves keep evolving and changing and not existing, the rules are not necessarily changing. And the spirit of the rules is to make sure that consumers are protected across payments, which is why things like disputes and chargebacks exist as a process. But they kind of assume that everyone is a good actor, which is not always the case. So kind of finding a way to straddle all of those different pieces of priority is what led to us creating KSAP, the disputes automation platform.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned sort of the happy path versus the unhappy path, because we've found that there's so much value in building with the unhappy path in mind. Any payment provider does well on the happy path, but how do they handle it if there's a network timeout during the payment?
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
what is first party fraud, and why should, acquirers, processors, and ISVs care about it?
Well, first party fraud, there's a lot of broader definitions out there, but I think a really easy way to understand it is first party fraud is when the consumer is exactly who they say they are. And they might be mistakenly or intentionally saying that something is wrong, right? And it's specifically in the concept of disputes, it's someone that's legitimate, like they're disputing a legitimate charge and saying that that wasn't them. And the reason why I say first party fraud has a broader definition is there are situations where someone will say, oh, that wasn't me, but they realize it was their kid, buying something, or a spouse, and they didn't realize that. And that technically is lumped under first party fraud, but truly the majority of first party fraud is people intentionally saying that wasn't me, or I made that transaction and I didn't get something when they absolutely did receive it.
So, what are the unique challenges with this type of fraud? Why is it so hard for banks and processors and ISVs to stay ahead of?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason why it's hard to stay ahead of this is it's really hard to stay ahead of something we can't identify in the first place. Right? If you can't measure it, it's really hard to manage. And that's one thing. The second thing is also when we say fraud, historically, we're thinking about third party fraud. We're thinking about someone taking over an identity, taking over an account. Account takeovers is a bit, ATOs are a big thing that we talk about, and they definitely still happen. But, thankfully, with fintech supporting this problem, we've been able to get it down significantly in the space. And especially with the advent of biometrics and how we can, and, of course, generative AI changes some of this landscape. And now we've got to have good deepfake detection and things like that. And maybe biometrics aren't as secure, but because a lot of the energy and attention, and even I think the media, immediately when you say fraud, they're thinking about some like faceless hacker outside taking control of PII. We don't actually think too much about this type of fraud. And even if we were thinking about it, it's really hard to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. Right? How do we prove that this person that's saying they ordered a couch and didn't get the couch actually got the couch? Right? How do we prove the person saying this wasn't them, especially when certain things aren't matching and they know exactly what to say, that it actually was them? So it's just hard. It's not something that people immediately think about when we think about fraud. It's really hard to identify. And even when we do identify it, specifically with disputes and how it kind of manifests, you have to have really good evidence. It needs to it's sort of innocent till proven guilty. Same thing over here too. You have to have really good evidence to even do something about it, to deny that claim and to say, no, I'm not going to be a universal refund center. There's probably going to be something we need to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think breaking it up into two steps. So sort of what are some best practices for, acquirers, processors, ISVs, and merchants, everyone on the acquiring side, to
Yeah.
prevent friendly fraud before it happens?
A great question. I think what's interesting, we've actually been spending a lot of time thinking about this at KSAP. So I'll kind of plug how we've been thinking about it. So first party fraud is a behavioral attack vector. And it usually is something that people have done before. And from that perspective, we've been seeing the sort of gap in the data intelligence market. So if you think about a credit score, right? The FICO credit score. The credit score tells you Brooke is likely to pay you back. Shanti isn't likely to pay you back. But we don't have a score that tells you Shanti is likely to buy a TV from you or buy something from you and turn around and pretend she didn't receive it 2 weeks later, right? Or turn around and pretend she didn't do it 2 weeks later. So we're actually releasing a KSAP first party fraud score that merchants and the folks that support merchants could actually look at to actually see when does it make sense to introduce some friction in the process to make sure we're covered in terms of liability and chargeback rights, right? So for example, PDS secure transactions have a very different liability shift. What that means is issuers can't necessarily easily say, like, they don't even have chargeback rights. In all honesty, a 3DS secure transaction is something where it's like, if it is 3DS secure, that's it. That's done. That's one way. And that's why we see a lot of big ticket items, think airline purchases, be protected with 3DS, right? 3D secure. I think the reason why merchants and acquirers in general are hesitant to put in place things like 3DS is because it introduces friction, right? It's the same reason why our country took so long to adopt chip enabled cards when Europe had it, years in the past. And that's because of friction. And we are, inherently a capitalistic economy and we don't want to introduce friction in payments. But sometimes friction is a feature, specifically in fraud. That's a lot of F words. Friction is a feature in fraud. But I really do believe if we had some sort of first party fraud score, which is what we are building and launching, we would be able to provide data to merchants so they can say, hey, Shanti is someone that tends to dispute a lot of things. We are going to introduce a little bit more friction to make sure that this purchase is protected. But maybe for Brooke, that friction doesn't make sense because there's no proof that this is something she tends to do. And if we can make this just a little bit easier for her, we're probably going to get that sale. We're probably going to get this deal. So that's an opportunity, right? Which is if you have behavioral data on the end consumer, you'd be able to do more intelligent things about protecting yourself from first party fraud and illegitimate chargebacks. Another thing to think about is also the network. So the networks do have some pieces of data along these lines. It's not a complete picture, but they do have data on what tends to be highly chargeback type transactions, right? For example, online gambling casinos, right? That tends to be a highly chargeback transactions. And the reason why, I mean, you don't need to be like a genius to figure it out, but there's better's regret. You bet on black when you should have bet on red, you lose all your money. And then you just think, I didn't do that. It wasn't me. But those are the kind of things where if you are in an MCC, if you're in a merchant category code that is at high risk for chargebacks, maybe it makes sense to introduce a little bit of friction and invest in some of that up front. So you don't need to lose all that money later on when you're inevitably going to get chargebacks for things that really shouldn't be chargebacked.
And such good advice. And then once chargebacks do inevitably happen, so first of all, tell me about how they work. What are they and why are they so painful for merchants? Why does managing and responding to chargebacks take up so much time?
Well, see, the thing with the chargeback, we can think about just like the dispute overall, which is you are saying something happened and I don't agree this thing happened, right? You're saying this transaction happened, I don't agree with it, or you're saying you sent me something and I never received it. But it's truly your version of reality is different from my version of reality. And that is what the crux of the problem is that when someone's coming in saying your version of the reality doesn't match my version of the reality, now we have to understand what is the merchant's reality and what's the consumer's reality. And because of that, the chargeback is literally the network essentially facilitating this conversation between the consumer and you as the merchant. And the consumer is saying X, Y, and Z, and you're saying A, B, and C. Now we actually have to get all the evidence as to how A, B, and C happened, right? And collecting of the evidence and understanding for this type of chargeback, for this type of reason, what kind of evidence is helpful. That whole collation process, the intelligence around chargebacks, and then responding to it timely, because everything has timelines around it, is what makes this so difficult and so cumbersome. And of course, there are tools and platforms out there, but the thing to remember is no one has skin in the game and no one has context the way you do as a merchant. So it's really important to understand what can you afford to lose? What can you not afford to lose? And what is the true cost of a chargeback? right? So let's say you're using a platform that will help you respond to some of these things. How much time is your team actually spending in collecting the evidence? Or let's say you're using a platform that says, oh, we'll collect all the evidence for you. But then in doing that, your chargeback recovery rate is way lower than it used to be. Is that worth it? And then the other thing to also think about is on top of all of this, so you've got understanding the consumer's version of the reality, you've got collecting your version of the reality, you've got the timelines imposed by the network and just overall regulations. Then you've also got network level limits, right? So you don't want to be a merchant that's a high risk merchant. You don't want to be a merchant that's leading to a lot of chargebacks. So there's network level sort of limits, which I think are good because we don't want this much friction in payments. We don't want bad acting merchants that are leading to a ton of chargebacks. And also note that on the issuer side, if you're leading to a lot of chargebacks, they might actually introduce a fraud rule that makes it impossible for anyone at their bank or credit union or fintech to actually transact with you as a merchant. There's that whole thing you have to keep in mind. And of course, this is like, just a small bit of what you're trying to do as a merchant, right? This is what we think is unhappy path. We think it's the exception to the rule, but it ends up taking up a lot of your time.
It's true. And I think we've noticed that only the largest merchants actually deal with enough chargebacks that they get really good at it.
Mhm.
For most merchants, they get maybe a few a month or less. So every time they have to respond to a chargeback, it's really disruptive because
Yeah.
there are no economies of scale. It's like doing it for the first time every time.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why we started KSAP, because there are certain things that make sense to have a very unique take, right? It's strategic advantage to do it your special way. Chargebacks and disputes is not one of them. That's the thing where you want to make sure that the people that are truly in a bad situation get covered immediately. And you can separate them out from the people that are just lying about it. And ideally, if you can get to those outcomes in a very cost effective way where your team does not need to spend a lot of their time, that's a really, really good outcome.
What are the best practices for merchants when they are then responding for chargebacks?
I think, and I would love to actually share more about this at a future time, but I think high level is having a very consistent way of pulling evidence and understanding the very high level categories of chargebacks where you can actually just have a mapping internally of this kind of chargeback needs this kind of evidence and make it like a one click thing for you to get. I think the other call out too is just remember that time is of the essence here. The sooner you can respond to that, the more time everyone has to really investigate the situation. So, from the dispute perspective, from the issuer side of things, let's say this transaction was done on a debit card, they've got 90 days to resolve this case, right? End to end. So being able to kind of work in that 90-day time frame and be extremely expedient is going to help everyone get the right number of back and forths they need to actually like complete that full picture. If you're waiting till the very last minute, you might actually just have to lose that money because you're out of window. You're out of the time window.
Yeah. A lot of the pain of chargeback management starts with old payments technology and like just a generally terrible user experience all around. What has this looked like historically and what could it be with modern technology? Like, how can modern technology make this hurt a lot less?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I like focusing less on exactly how archaic and why our existing technology is so archaic, because that could be a whole show in and of itself. But I think when we think about how we can modernize this, there's a few things that come to mind. Number one is kind of at the core of it, it's all about reality. It's about everyone's perception of reality. So I'll give you a very simple example. As a merchant, if you make sure your merchant name sounds like your establishment, or at least the way you present to consumers, you're way less likely to get chargebacks saying, I don't know what this is. This wasn't me. The number of times we see a merchant that's, a bodega on the corner of the street, but their merchant name is 123 star hashtag. Like that, obviously that looks a little fraudulent, right? So I'm saying that as like a simple example of a way you can just take some, I would say, common sense, a little bit of psychology to ask yourself, how do we make sure that we can consistently keep our consumers on the same page as us? So some examples would be making sure your merchant name is update. If you're sending them something, you send them a tracker, right? A tracking number around it, maybe even a status tracker holistically, being very open and transparent. That's not only going to help you with your app reviews, right? And your overall just sentiment with consumers, but it's also going to reduce the likelihood of chargebacks. Because even if they were to commit first party fraud and say that wasn't me, you have an abundance of proof to share. Hey, this is all the communication we sent them. They had all of these opportunities to say they wanted a red sweater when we sent them a green one. So they don't really have a leg to stand on. So I think honestly, best practices as a merchant will also lend itself well to best practices for chargebacks. And to answer your point around how we can modernize this, I think the opportunity here is instead of relying on manual effort, to have that open communication and that upfront communication, leverage technology to automate that, right? And leverage technology like, I mean, even partners like KSAP to understand, okay, at a network consortium level, what does first party fraud look like? What is Shanti's first party fraud score? What is Brooke's first party fraud score? And use that to actually level up or level down the amount of friction that you have in your payment process, specifically the amount of authorization that you require up front, whether it's 3DS or even getting them to sign proof of authorizations or POAs. And then the third thing is thinking about generative AI, there's definitely an opportunity to take unstructured text, like the narrative that comes through a chargeback, summarize it and understand it. And then also an opportunity to respond. So you can leverage generative AI to do things that used to take 50 minutes in 5 seconds. So asking yourself how you can do that or partnering with platforms like ours that do think about that, as our day-to-day job. And so those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you called out just even like the merchant descriptor. It's funny, my husband is a leaded glass artist, so he orders a lot of like very specific materials from a lot of different suppliers. And some of them I'm used to seeing on his credit card statements, but sometimes we'll get one that's just like a string of letters and numbers. And the only way to figure out what the purchase was for is if he remembers what he ordered on that date. Like, you spent about this much money on this date. What was it? Or to go through his emails and look and try to match the dollar amount.
No, seriously, seriously. And it's awesome that you guys are at least doing that because other people will be like, dispute, dispute, dispute. And also, you mentioned like, what did he buy on that day? A lot of people don't know that sometimes transactions will settle or post for a day or two after the exact payment was made. And that itself could be very jarring, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Or especially if there's like a multiple week delay before it ships and they charge the card when it ships.
Yeah.
By then you can have forgotten what you had ordered.
Exactly right. Or, you remind me of another example too. If you're a merchant that thinks about that has a subscription service or a subscription product, making it really hard to cancel, though it might seem like it's a good thing to do for your business, might not be for your chargeback ratios because people are going to come back and say, no, you didn't let me cancel, or no, this wasn't me. And having certain like upfront communication that they actually have to consent to or sign. Again, think of it along the lines of authorizing this will make it much harder for them to say, I forgot to listen to my calendar event that told me to cancel my 30-day trial. So I'm going to pretend I didn't do this at all. So depending on the type of service you offer, there's definitely a little exercise you can do, which is put yourself in the shoes of your consumer and ask yourself, what are all the opportunities I have to get them to opt in to what they're committing to and what they're receiving, and to also communicate up front with when and how they're going to be receiving that service or product.
Yeah, that's really good advice. At Rainforest, we work with a lot of vertical software companies or ISVs, and chargebacks are probably one of their top 3 drivers of support tickets. There's merchant onboarding issues, risk holds, and chargebacks. So how can ISVs make the chargeback process better or worse through their product?
Great question. I think the number one thing is to treat these quote unquote exceptions, right, as a first class citizen in your service, right? It's really nice to think, oh, everyone's going to love it. And everyone that pays for it is exactly the person who they say they are, et cetera. It's really nice to assume that, but then that leads to a lot of pain for you and your consumers. So to really think about, okay, let's make it really easy. If someone has an issue, with our service or they have an issue with our product, let's give them a really easy way to talk to us about it, right? And very conscious of it. Like if we make it crazy, crazy easy or we put ideas in their head that might unnecessarily increase volume for you. So you want to find a good balance, but by treating this as a first class citizen, and I like to call it eating your veggies sooner, like eating your veggies first, having that conversation and giving them an opportunity to have that with you and your team and your service will eliminate chargebacks for you. And even if, because now there are people that have been so aware of disputes, even if they're not reaching out to you first and they're talking to their bank about the transaction, wanting to have them be their universal refund center, it still goes a long way by making it extremely easy to talk to you and get the version of truth from you rather than needing to go through the network and the chargeback process. Because as we know, that is cumbersome, it is costly, and it is painful long run for your reputation as a merchant in the ecosystem of payments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we really like for platforms, like for these ISVs also, is to make use of the data they already have. A lot of the data that they need or that their merchants need in order to fight a chargeback, a lot
Yeah.
of it already lives on the platform. And they can cut out so much work just by pulling, like, here's the signed quote, here's the invoice, here's the communications.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And like to our point of earlier of just making it really easy to understand that audit history, like what exactly happened?
Yeah.
What is our version of reality goes a long way. And kind of extending that back to the point around data, there is the exact data we need for the evidence on reality. And then there's also behavioral data of people that tend to behave in this way tend to be ones that are going to file chargebacks or tend to be ones that are less upset. Or maybe our product description for this exact service needs to be updated because we're seeing an exorbitant number of chargebacks focused on that product versus the other one. So you can even use the fact that you're getting chargebacks as a signal of clarity that you need to introduce in your process.
Absolutely. Chargebacks become part of that feedback loop.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, is there anything we didn't cover or any sort of parting words for acquirers, processors, ISVs, merchants when it comes to first party fraud and chargebacks?
Yeah, I think you've done a really great job of asking amazing questions, and I hope this is helpful for everyone listening. I think if there's anything I'm leaving people with, the main thing is thinking about first party fraud as a real problem. Fraud is evolving, we're evolving, keeps us on our toes, whether we like it or not. And really asking ourselves, all right, how do we make it really hard for someone to refute our version of reality? And that is actually much simpler than it is complex. But just know that it's an important thing to do because first party fraud is only growing. It's been growing 30% year over year, especially since COVID. And a lot of people are aware of disputes and chargebacks as a way of quote unquote easy money. We as at KSAP are very excited to be partners in the ecosystem, to be the front runners in collecting all of this data and sharing this sort of FICO score equivalent, but for first party fraud. But that's only going to go a certain amount along the way. You've got to, as a merchant, acquirer, ISV, you've got to think about how do we make sure that this ever growing problem and ever growing consumer behavior doesn't impact our bottom line linearly. And that's where partnering with platforms like ours, or even just taking another look at your upfront service, will actually help you a lot down the line.
That's really good advice. And thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brooke. This is so fun. Thank you.